I grew up in a quiet little town where privacy was more of an idea than a reality since everyone knew everyone else's business. My dad owned the local hardware store, and my mom made sure our home felt like a warm, welcoming retreat. I had an older sister, and while we had our fair share of sibling spats, she always had my back. My childhood was simple, helping at the store, playing sports with friends, and learning life lessons about integrity and hard work from my parents. Things were steady until my teenage years, when I enrolled at a prestigious all-boys private school. My parents believed in education, and this was their way of giving me a shot at something bigger. That school changed everything. It was my first real taste of social class divides. The wealthier kids never let me forget I was from a lower middle-class family. Their taunts weren't just verbal, sometimes, they escalated into physical fights. I didn't back down, though. Around that time, I met Linc and Voss, a boxer with a sharp wit and a sharper punch. We clicked instantly, and his friendship became a turning point in my life. Lincoln, who everyone just called Linc, had a cop for a dad and a reputation for being fearless. After one heated match at the local boxing gym where he knocked me flat, we became inseparable. Linc also attended my school, thanks to his dad's connections. Together, we had each other's backs against the bullies. One day, a guy named Curtis Langley crossed the line, making a crack about my family. I lost it, broke his nose, and sent a couple of his teeth flying. Linc wasn't one to stand by, he took on the other guys who tried to jump in. Linc could be the most loyal friend, but to his enemies, he was downright ruthless. We made quick work of the others and brushed it off. This wasn't new to me, bullies had been pushing me for years, but this time was different. Curtis's father, a big-shot businessman with a lot of influence, made it his mission to teach us a lesson. He got both Linc and me suspended for the rest of the school year, only a month left, by throwing his weight around with the school board. Worse, he had us charged with assault. Fortunately, girls from the nearby private school saw everything and testified that Curtis started the fight. Linc's dad, being the deputy police chief, helped as well. The charges were dropped, but the suspension was upheld. To make it worse, Curtis's father demanded my parents pay for his son's surgery. My folks didn't have that kind of money, but the storm eventually passed. I spent the summer working long hours at my dad's hardware store, keeping out of trouble. Linc and I hit the gym, ran together, and stayed tight. He even tried his luck flirting with my older sister, but she was on her way to college and brushed him off. High school stayed rough, with Curtis holding a grudge that never died. He never tried to fight me again, he'd learned his lesson, but his bitterness didn't fade. Linc and I continued boxing, and he went on to become a heavyweight state champion. I did well too, landing in the state's top 10. Linc had the skills to go pro, but he didn't want to end up like his uncle, who was a broken man after years in the ring. Our senior year was about cruising in our cars, going to parties, and dating girls from the neighboring school. I lost my innocence to a girl named Ellis Granger. It wasn't love, just a mix of timing and opportunity. Curtis tried to get under my skin by dating Allison afterward, but I didn't care. She and I had been in a short chapter. After graduation, Linc and I faced a choice, college or something else. My family couldn't afford college, so we both signed up for the Army. Basic training meant we missed prom, but we didn't feel like we'd missed much. While I struggled with the military's rigid structure, Linc thrived. He set his sights on the special forces. After basic training, I headed home to prepare for officer training, while Linc pushed deeper into active duty. It was the first time in years we'd been apart, and I didn't know it would be a long time before I saw him again. Officer training went better than I'd expected, and I graduated as Second Lieutenant Ellis Granger. The Army offered me a business degree in exchange for 3 more years of service, and I took the deal. I was stationed with the Army History Unit, which turned out to be office work. It wasn't action-packed, but I enjoyed the chance to learn about military traditions and history. My sergeant was one of those rare leaders who made you want to do better. Meanwhile, I hadn't heard from Linc in a while, which worried me since he'd been deployed to high-risk areas. But I knew he could handle himself. Back home, I fell into a steady rhythm of work, study, and the occasional weekend boxing match. Dating was hit or miss. I wasn't looking for flings, but it felt like that's all I kept finding. I wanted something real, but it seemed far off, until everything changed. One summer, I returned home for a weekend music festival. The plan was simple: visit my parents, see Linc's family, and reconnect with old friends. On Friday night, I got caught up on all the local gossip. My dad was thinking of selling the hardware store, and Linc's dad had become the police chief. No one had heard from Linc for a while, but that was typical for his line of work. Saturday started with a run and breakfast with my folks. I helped Dad open the store, and that's where I ran into Allison Greer, now Allison Langley. She'd married Curtis right after high school. She was in town for the festival with her cousin, Carina Reed, who caught my eye right away. Carina was striking, confident but down to earth. We hit it off and made plans to meet up later at the festival. My dad, never missing a chance to tease me, warned that Allison was still trouble, but I wasn't paying attention. Carina was all I could think about. That night at the festival, I found Allison already drunk and flirting with anyone who glanced her way. Carina looked uncomfortable as she stood nearby. I stepped in, bought them some food and drinks, and sat with them. Allison rambled about her perfect life with Curtis, which everyone knew was a lie. She'd married him right after high school, probably because she was pregnant, but the baby hadn't made it. Curtis, now managing his dad's international business, was overseas, conveniently far away. After a while, Allison wandered off with Peter Munson to check out his car, and Carina let out a playful sigh of relief. Finally, she said with a smile. Carina and I spent the rest of the evening talking. It was one of those conversations that just flows effortlessly. We had more in common than I'd expected. She worked in human resources at Langley Enterprises, thanks to Allison pulling some strings. We exchanged numbers before the night ended, and by the next week, we were already on our first date. Things moved fast from there. Carina was traditional, which meant no intimacy before marriage. It was frustrating at times, but I respected it. It gave us time to build something real. Our relationship grew strong, even with Allison always hovering nearby like an unwelcome guest and the faint shadow of Curtis still looming in the background. Carina's parents were better off financially, but they liked me, especially her father, a retired general. We bonded over our shared military experience. Her mother, however, wasn't as easy to win over. She insisted on a prenuptial agreement, probably with encouragement from Curtis. But that didn't stop our wedding. Linc couldn't make it back for the big day, but his younger brother stepped in as my best man. With Curtis overseas, we had no disruptions. It was the best day of my life. Marriage suited us. We bought a house in a quiet neighborhood and started talking about kids. But first, I had a choice to make: stay in the army or switch to civilian life. Carina and I agreed that it was time for me to put my degree to use, so I started searching for a new career. Luck was on my side. I landed a role at a major financial firm overseeing internal and external security. The pay was double what I'd made in the army, so I left the military for good. With the financial boost, we decided to start trying for kids right away. But after months of no progress, I went to the doctor, only to learn I was sterile. I had planned to break the news to Carina during a surprise cruise, but things took a turn. She excitedly announced she'd been promoted and would be traveling for business with none other than Curtis Langley, now her boss. I had a bad feeling about it but didn't want to come off as insecure. Carina assured me Curtis had grown up and was strictly business. The morning she left, Curtis arrived in a sleek black limo, grinning like he'd already won. I watched them drive off, unsettled. For the next few days, I stewed in it. Carina called to check in, acting as if everything was fine. Then, on Saturday morning, there was a knock at my door. It was Linc. He looked tougher than I remembered, with the sharp edge of someone who'd seen too much. War will do that to a man. We hugged, grabbed beers, and sat down to catch up. Linc had left the army after a decade, fed up with the grind. I brought him up to speed on my life, my new job, my marriage to Carina, and Curtis being her boss. We laughed over the irony of Allison marrying that guy. At one point, Linc spotted a photo from my wedding. He squinted at it and asked, "Is that General Reed?" I nodded, explaining it was Carina's father. Linc's face shifted as he revealed something I didn't see coming: General Reed had been his commanding officer in the Special Forces. Linc also dropped a bombshell about Carina's mother, hinting she'd been involved in multiple affairs with officers, which led to the general retiring to avoid scandal. I sat in silence, my view of Carina's family taking a serious hit. Before Linc left, I invited him to stay, but he said he had to go. Police academy training started for him on Monday. We agreed he'd visit again once Carina got back. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake Linc's words. If Carina's mom was like that, was it possible Carina could be too? The following week flew by. Work kept me busy, and Carina called a few times. By Friday night, she was home, acting like everything was normal. We spent the evening reconnecting, but I couldn't ignore the questions buzzing in my mind. The next day, I told her Linc had stopped by and that I wanted them to meet. Carina agreed, not knowing what was coming. When Linc arrived with flowers and a bottle of wine, I was ready to make the introductions. But before I could say anything, Carina's face lit up. "Oh my God, Linc," she exclaimed. Linc gave a lopsided grin. "Hey, Carina. Long time." My jaw practically hit the floor. Turns out, they already knew each other from the base when General Reed was in charge. They spent the next 2 hours catching up, and I felt like an outsider in my own home. While I was cooking dinner, I overheard Carina ask, "Does he know?" I walked in and asked what they were talking about. They both went quiet. Linc left shortly after, saying Carina and I had some things to discuss. That's when Carina came clean. She admitted she and Linc had dated back at the base with her father's approval. They'd broken up when Linc got deployed to Iraq. She promised it was ancient history, but I knew better. Linc still had feelings for her. It suddenly made sense why he skipped our wedding. I asked Carina if this was going to be a problem, and she assured me she loved only me. I wanted to believe her, but doubt had settled in. Later, I called Linc to get his side. He apologized, saying he didn't want to stir up old issues. I told him I appreciated his honesty, but things didn't feel resolved. Life went on, with Carina diving deeper into her new job. Talk of having kids faded into the background, and I never told her about my sterility. Meanwhile, Linc became a cop and eventually joined the tactical response unit. At home, things felt off. Carina was working late and traveling with Curtis more frequently. Our intimacy dwindled, and suspicion grew like a splinter under my skin. I decided to step away from the tension and help my dad with closing down the hardware store as he prepared for retirement. Carina supported the idea, claiming she'd be tied up with work all week anyway. At the store, Dad caught me off guard with a blunt warning. "Son," he said, "protect yourself." I asked what he meant, and he sighed before dropping a bomb. "People are talking. Curtis Langley's been bragging about sleeping with Carina. Says it's a regular thing, 3 times a week." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Suspicion is one thing, but confirmation? That's something else. I felt like an idiot. My face burned with anger. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to start. I heard that Allison Langley was back at her parents' estate, so I drove straight there. She opened the door looking surprised to see me. "Is Curtis sleeping with my wife?" I asked bluntly. She stared at me like I'd just flipped her world upside down. "You don't mess around, huh, Ellis?" she muttered, wiping at her face. "It's all over town," I said coldly. Allison's face crumpled. She admitted she'd left Curtis and was back living with her parents while sorting out a divorce. Their marriage had been a disaster from the start, forced by circumstance and held together by resentment. Curtis cheated openly, even keeping a secret apartment for his affairs. When Allison found out Curtis was messing around with Carina, it was her final straw. She packed up and left. I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. Allison vowed to make Curtis pay, but I had my own plans. I wished her luck, hoping it would be the last time we spoke. When I got home, my parents were out, and Carina had left a note saying she needed to talk urgently. I ignored it. I wasn't in the mood to hear more lies. I grabbed a beer, sat on the deck, and let my mind churn. My parents got home later, and after a few more beers, I went to bed. The next morning, I woke to the smell of breakfast. I sat quietly with my folks, eating like nothing had changed. Afterward, Dad and I went to the store for the final handoff. We spent the afternoon fishing, talking about everything except what was really on my mind. When we got back, Carina's BMW was in the driveway. Inside, she was sitting with tissues in hand, fresh from a talk with my mom. My parents left to give us space. Carina broke down, crying about how Allison had called to stir things up. She claimed the rumors about her and Curtis were lies, that their late meetings were legitimate business. She swore she'd stop attending the late-night meetings altogether if that's what it took to prove her loyalty. Her story felt rehearsed. I wasn't buying it. I knew Allison had nothing to gain by lying. Curtis hated me. The Reed women had a reputation for infidelity. It all added up. Carina wasn't my partner anymore, she was an opponent. I played it cool, nodding like I believed her. We went out for dinner, and by the next morning, she was smiling, thinking everything was fine. The moment she left, I started planning. I called Linc and asked for help with surveillance on Carina. I also had my dad tell Carina I'd be staying at their house until Sunday, giving me extra time to act. I packed up and drove back to the city, making a detour to check into a hotel far from anyone we knew. At work, I greeted my boss and requested another week off, which he approved. While I was there, I opened a new bank account under my name and quietly transferred half of our joint savings into it. My future paychecks would be rerouted as well. Feeling more secure, I went back to the hotel. Linc finally returned my call. He apologized for the delay, he'd just been promoted to detective. We agreed to meet at a local cop hangout bar. We found a booth in the back and ordered a couple of beers. I laid everything out for Linc, the rumors about Carina and Curtis, the late-night meetings, and her sudden change in behavior. He listened intently, his eyes sharp with calculation. Then, with a grin, he joked, "Want me to kneecap Curtis for you?" We both laughed, but beneath it, we knew things had gotten serious. If Carina was cheating, I needed proof. Linc offered to handle it, promising he'd tap into his connections to get the truth. The next morning, I woke up with a mild hangover but followed Linc's advice, act normal. I canceled my leave from work and told Carina I'd be home that night. She welcomed me with open arms, and over dinner, she suggested it might be time to start a family. I played along, knowing full well it was impossible, I was sterile. I said nothing, just nodded and smiled. Over the next few weeks, anxiety gnawed at me as I waited for Linc's update. Carina noticed my mood and questioned the change in our joint bank account. I told her I'd lent money to my dad, which seemed to satisfy her. Finally, in early December, Linc called. We met at the same bar where it had all started. He slid an envelope across the table, a smug grin on his face. "Good news," he said. The private investigator's report was inside, and I braced myself as I flipped through it. Carina had been faithful. No late-night trysts, no secret rendezvous, just work, home, and routine. Meanwhile, Curtis was a disaster. The report exposed his gambling problem, his pill habit, and his involvement with multiple women. It also mentioned that Curtis was on the verge of being busted for cocaine possession, and when it hit the news, it would ruin him. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I bought a round for the bar, thanking Linc for everything, and headed home feeling lighter than I had in months. When I walked through the door, Carina was already waiting for me. She pulled me in close, more affectionate than she'd been in weeks. That night, we had one of the most intense, passionate moments we'd had in a long time. Afterward, she curled up next to me and said, "You're going to be a father." Her words hit me like a slap to the face. I sat there frozen, every muscle locked in place. She must have mistaken my shock for joy because she smiled wide and explained she'd planned to tell me after the first trimester. She went on about nursery colors, baby showers, and maternity leave, but I couldn't hear a word of it. Reality set in hard. I was sterile. The baby couldn't be mine. It was impossible. I stayed quiet, pretending to be happy, while my mind spun in 1,000 directions. I watched Carina sleep peacefully that night, while rage boiled in my chest. How could she lie so easily? How did she think she'd get away with it? I couldn't lie still, so I got up and went to my study. My gun was in the drawer, and for a second, the idea crossed my mind. But I shut that thought down fast. I needed a plan, not prison time. This wasn't just about Carina anymore. Linc had betrayed me too, and Curtis was at the center of it all. I was surrounded by enemies. The first move was to reach out to Curtis. I left early the next morning and called his office, leaving an urgent message. Hours passed with no reply. I wasn't about to show up at his office where Carina or her coworkers might see me. So, I took a different approach. I rented an SUV, parked outside his office, and waited. When Curtis finally left, I tailed him to an upscale apartment building. I saw my moment, pulled up behind him, and grabbed him before he knew what was happening. Panic hit him instantly as I shoved him into the SUV. "I'm not here to hurt you," I said, keeping my tone low and controlled. "We just need to talk." I drove us to a secluded spot near a quiet lake. Curtis was a wreck, breathing hard like he'd just run a marathon. I handed him the investigator's report that Linc had compiled. As he read it, his eyes darted across the page, his face turning pale. "This is all lies," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Allison must have set this up." "Not Allison," I said coldly. "This came from Linc Voss." The realization hit him hard. He leaned forward, hands on his face, mumbling curses. He knew Linc wasn't someone to play with. "Look, I'm not interested in your dirty laundry," I continued. "But I know you've been reckless. You're sloppy. And Linc's about to frame you for a cocaine bust." Curtis blinked, his face drenched in sweat. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, genuinely confused. "Because I need your father's help," I replied. "I want everything he's got on Linc Voss. Background, connections, weaknesses, everything." Curtis hesitated but knew he had no choice. He called his father and explained the situation. His father didn't sound happy, but eventually agreed to send me a full report on Linc. "Couple of days," the old man grumbled. With that, Curtis arranged for his father's people to help him disappear for a while. I stayed with him until his ride arrived, knowing it would throw off Linc's plans and buy me some breathing room. Back in the city, I returned the rental car, then kept my head down. I needed space to think. Work sent me on a 2-week assignment at the regional offices, and I jumped at the chance. Carina wasn't happy about it, but I reminded her that with a baby on the way, I needed to stay on my boss's good side. That shut her up. The trip was a welcome escape. 2 weeks later, I came back to a package waiting at my hotel. It was the report on Linc Voss from Curtis's father. I sat down, poured myself some whiskey, and started reading. Halfway through, I had to stop and pour another glass. The Linc I knew at 18 was not the man he'd become at 28. His file was darker than I'd imagined. It laid out his violent childhood, how he'd witnessed his mother's murder. His stepmother and father had put him into boxing to channel his rage, which worked for a while. He became a champion, but his darkness only grew. The military had only sharpened it. Everything I thought I knew about him was a lie. When Linc joined the Special Forces, everything changed. His commanding officer? General Edward Reed, Carina's father. The report detailed how Linc and Reed clashed constantly. Reed was ruthless, more concerned with mission success than his men. Linc was the opposite, always looking out for his squad. Their biggest conflict? Linc's relationship with Reed's daughter, Carina. At first, it was just to spite the general, but it got serious fast. Linc even proposed. Carina turned him down, saying she needed her father's blessing. Shortly after, Reed sent Linc's unit on a high-risk mission. It went south, soldiers died, Linc was injured, and Reed retired to avoid a scandal. That's when everything fell into place. Linc had never gotten over it. He'd loved Carina, and when she ended things, he saw it as betrayal. So when he found out I was marrying her, he saw an opportunity for revenge. He left the military, joined the police force in my city, and waited for his moment. His plan was clear now: seduce Carina, get her pregnant, and drag her name through the mud to ruin General Reed's legacy. And when Linc heard I was helping Curtis escape, it put his entire plan in jeopardy. I knew one thing for certain: Linc would come for me. I had to move first. My only option was to get Carina out of the way. I had a choice to make: stay and face Linc head-on or leave before things spiraled out of control. When I got home, the silence felt unnatural. The dog was gone, and most of Carina's clothes were missing. In the kitchen, I found a note. She claimed she had a business meeting and said she'd sent the dog to stay with my parents. It sounded like a cover story. My gut told me she was with Linc. To be sure, I called the police station and asked about Linc's schedule. They said he was on a 2-week vacation. That was enough to raise my suspicions. I debated for a while before making a bold move. I called Ben Langley, Curtis's father. He actually answered. "What do you want, trailer trash?" "You already got the report," he sneered. "Yeah, thanks for that." "A little late, though," I shot back. "So why are you wasting my time?" he asked impatiently. "I'm looking for my wife, Carina Granger." "Seen her?" There was a pause before he chuckled. "How's married life treating you?" he asked mockingly. "She's with Ted Morrison, the stand-in CEO. Big meeting today," he added. "Thanks for that," I said, ready to hang up. But he couldn't resist one more jab. She's probably getting the grand tour of his bedroom, he sneered before hanging up. I wanted to believe Carina had told the truth this time, but I still wondered, where was Linc? I didn't have to wonder for long. The next morning, I woke up with a clear head and a decision in mind. I was done. Carina, Linc, all of it, I was walking away. Let Linc have his twisted revenge on the Reed family. I was done playing games. I'd loved Carina once, but she'd killed that love with her lies. Revenge was tempting, but I valued my peace more. As I mulled it over, Carina called. I ignored it. After a shower and some coffee, I went to work and scheduled a meeting with a lawyer. By 10 a.m., I'd cleared out our joint accounts, turning it all into cash. At 10:15 a.m., my life changed again. A courier arrived with a package. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. I opened it carefully. Inside were 2 notes and a VHS tape. One note was scrawled in what looked like blood. It read, "I know." The second was a newspaper clipping with the headline, "CEO of Langley Corporation found dead." Curtis Langley was dead. Found on a beach. The police suspected foul play. I didn't need to watch the tape to know what was on it. It would be Curtis confessing. Linc had gotten to him. My training kicked in. My first thought, get out. Disappear. I didn't tell my secretary a thing as I walked out of the office and drove straight out of the city. 3 things were clear. Curtis had confessed everything to Linc. Linc could track me down no matter where I went. Linc wasn't going to stop until I was gone. I drove straight to the one man I trusted, Hank Nusselt, my old sergeant from the army. If anyone could help me vanish, it was him. When I got to his beach house, he was lounging in a chair, beer in hand, sunglasses on like he hadn't a care in the world. "Lieutenant Granger, to what do I owe the honor?" he said, grinning. "I need to disappear, Hank," I told him, my face dead serious. No questions asked. The grin vanished. "All right," he said, standing up. He made a call, then brought me downstairs to take some photos. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, but I didn't answer. We kept the conversation light as we waited. An hour later, a guy showed up with the tools to create a new identity. We spent the night going through the process. Hank let me crash at his place, but I barely slept. My mind kept going back to Carina. Was she safe? Did she even realize how much danger she was in? I decided to warn her, even if she didn't deserve it. I called her, and she picked up almost instantly. "Ellis? What's going on?" she asked. Her voice was calm, unaware of the storm about to hit her. "Listen to me carefully, Carina," I said. "Get your things and leave the hotel. Don't go home. Don't go to your parents' house. Run." Her laugh was small, confused. "What are you talking about? Are you drunk?" "Just go, Carina," I snapped. "Linc is not who you think he is. That baby you're carrying? It's his. I know everything. You've been warned." "Ellis, what?" she started to say, but I hung up. I smashed the phone, threw the pieces in separate trash bins, and poured a drink. I'd done my part. If she stayed, that was on her. The next morning, I handed Hank $10,000 for my new identity. From that moment on, I wasn't Ellis Granger anymore. I was Michael Harris, complete with a new ID, social security number, and documents. Hank promised to have a car ready for me by tomorrow, but I had one final loose end to tie up. Ellis Granger needed to die. Years ago, one of my soldiers told me about his corrupt little hometown called Cinder Bend. Crime was low, but the police force was lazy and bribe-friendly. It was perfect for what I had in mind. I drove there, checked into a motel under my real name, and made sure the staff remembered me. Over the next couple of days, I made small talk with the locals, especially the sheriff and the mayor. I needed them to remember me too. The most important part of my plan was the cliff outside of town. It was known for accidents, people driving off the edge to their deaths. I scouted it out, found the perfect spot, and hid some supplies. The next day, I found a farmer selling an old dirt bike. I paid cash, loaded it in the back of my truck, and made sure it was ready for use. On Saturday, it was showtime. I had one last stop to make, the morgue. I slipped in quietly, paying off the night attendant. He let me into the room where Matt Smith was kept. I picked a body that was close to my height and weight. Another bribe made sure the guy forgot I was ever there. I knew the attendant would be on duty later that night, perfect timing. That night, I hit up a local dive bar. I bought drinks for everyone, made jokes, played the loud, wild outsider role. I made sure people would remember Ellis Granger being here, being seen. At one point, I threw $500 on the bar and yelled, "Drinks on me." Everyone swarmed, and I slipped out unnoticed. I drove to the cliff. It was dark, the only light coming from my truck's headlights. I pulled out the body I'd stashed there earlier and dressed it in my clothes. My wallet, my keys, everything I needed to leave behind went on the body. Then I soaked both the truck and the body in whiskey, just to sell the story. I popped the truck's gas cap, shoved a fuel-soaked rag in it. As the truck rolled toward the edge, I flicked the lighter and set the rag ablaze. Flames danced up the fuel-soaked cloth as I watched the truck plunge over the cliff. The explosion lit up the night, a fiery end for Ellis Granger. I didn't wait to see the aftermath. I hopped on the dirt bike and rode away into the darkness, chasing my freedom. By early morning, I arrived at Hank Nusselt's beach house. He was waiting with a beat-up pickup truck and a plan. "If you really want to disappear," he said, "I've got a cabin you can use." My old man left it to me. Middle of nowhere, near a town called Second Hollow. Nobody will bother you there. The name felt fitting. I agreed without hesitation. Before I left, Hank handed me a phone. "Only use this to receive my messages. If you get a text that says eagle flies, pack up and leave immediately," he warned. After grabbing my new ID, clothes, and essentials, I hugged Hank and drove toward the cabin. It was exactly what I needed, isolated, quiet, and surrounded by woods thick enough to swallow any sign of life. By lunchtime, I was inside, unpacking my gear. Hank had left enough supplies to last me a month. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my new ID with the name Michael Harris. "I hope they all believe I'm dead," I muttered to myself. The days passed slowly. I kept busy by training, running the trails around the cabin, and doing strength exercises. I planned to grow a beard and keep my hair long to change my appearance before venturing into town. Time and patience were my weapons now. A week later, I got a text from Hank. "Ellis Granger is dead. Funeral next week. We'll watch over your family." Guilt gnawed at me. My parents would be crushed, but I had to believe it was the only way to keep them safe. 3 weeks into life as Michael Harris, I was leaner, stronger, and rougher around the edges. My beard had grown thick, and I could barely recognize myself in the mirror. Still, I held off on going into town for another week. I wanted to be unrecognizable. With nothing but time on my hands, I finally watched the tape Linc had sent. It was worse than I expected. The footage showed Curtis Langley bound to a chair, battered and bleeding. He was barely conscious, but his voice was clear. He admitted to everything, the affairs, the bribes, and his involvement with Linc's plans. The man behind the mask, the butcher doing the interrogating, was Linc. The way he moved, his voice, even his casual way of wiping his hands with a cloth like it was nothing, told me all I needed to know. At the end of the tape, Linc leaned into the camera, his eyes piercing through the mask. "I'm coming for you, Ellis. And I'm going to destroy everything you love. Count on it." I sat there, gripping the armrests so tightly I nearly snapped them. The man I'd once called my best friend was gone. This was something else. A predator in human form. I knew one thing for sure, he wouldn't stop. Not until I was dead. Not until my family was dead. I couldn't live like that. Watching the tape flipped a switch inside me. I'd spent the past month hiding. No more. It was time to get ready for war. I ramped up my training, longer runs, heavier lifts, shooting practice. Every shot had to be perfect. I needed precision if I was going to face someone like Linc. By week 5, I was ready. I ventured into town for the first time, sticking to the edges and avoiding too much attention. I bought supplies, a used laptop, and a burner phone. At a pawn shop, I picked up a 7mm semi-auto rifle, a 9mm SIG P228, and enough ammunition to make me feel prepared. I even found an old punching bag and gloves. On the way back, I spotted a sign for puppies. Impulse got the better of me, and I stopped. The litter of border collie pups was yipping at the fence, pawing for attention. One of them, a bold little pup with bright eyes, caught my attention. I bought him on the spot, named him Jess, and took him back to the cabin. He'd be my early warning system and, more importantly, my only companion. Back at the cabin, I set up my gear, hung the punching bag, and logged onto the laptop. I searched for any news about Ellis Granger. One of the first hits was a local paper's headline. Drunken man burns in fiery crash near Cinder Bend. The story described me as a friendly visitor who'd been seen around town, drinking heavily before driving off the cliff. Sheriff Tromer confirmed it was an unfortunate accident with no sign of foul play. My funeral was mentioned in a separate article, and I knew it was Hank's doing. For now, the plan has worked. Ellis Granger was dead. I was free. The next 6 months were a cycle of training, isolation, and short supply runs to town. Locals started calling me Grizzly Adams because of my long hair and thick beard. It was perfect. Michael Harris was invisible. I focused on staying sharp, running drills, target practice, and spending quiet nights with Jess curled up beside me. One July afternoon, I checked the local news from back home and felt a chill crawl up my spine. The old family hardware store, now owned by someone else, had burned down in a suspicious fire. I knew it wasn't random. It was Linc. He was sending a message. But the next story was even worse. The Reed family curse. The headline described a tragic series of deaths. Allison Greer had fallen down the stairs while drunk and broken her neck. At her funeral, a car crash claimed the lives of her parents, General Reed, and his wife. Carina Reed Granger was listed as the sole inheritor of the Reed family fortune. I stared at the article, my heart pounding. Carina had somehow come out of all this as the last one standing. But one detail nagged at me: recently lost her husband to self-destruction. My death had been reported as an accident, but now it was being framed as something darker. I knew Carina had to be involved somehow. Then I saw it, the final twist. Wedding announcement: Carina Reed Granger and Linc Voss. I stared at the screen for a long time, letting the rage build slowly, like a fire catching on dry wood. She married him. She married Linc. I knew what I had to do. No more hiding. I packed my SIG P228, a bag of supplies, and my dog Jess. I drove back to Hank's beach house. He didn't recognize me at first, but Jess's excitement gave me away. "Lieutenant. Look at you, Grizzly Adams," he laughed, hugging me. After settling in with a beer, I laid it all out for him. I told him everything: Linc's betrayal, Carina's lies, the staged death, the reports about the Reed family, and her marriage to Linc. I showed him the articles and asked him to keep them safe in case something happened to me. Hank's face hardened. "Are you sure about this, Lieutenant? You're talking about going up against a Special Forces operative gone rogue. Guys like Linc don't play fair." "I know, Hank," I said, locking eyes with him. "But I'm done running. If it's him or me, I'm picking me." Hank shook his head. "You know he won't stop until one of you is dead." "Then I'll make sure it's him," I replied. That night, I drove back to the city, my old hunting grounds. Ellis Granger was gone, but Michael Harris had a score to settle. I checked into a cheap hotel, stashed my gear, and texted Hank to let him know I was safe. My first move was to pay a visit to the hospital, where Ben Langley was recovering from a heart attack. I knew the layout of the hospital and confirmed his room 319, 3rd floor. By the time I arrived, visiting hours were over, just as I wanted. My long hair and beard made it easy to avoid being recognized. I slipped into a restroom, waited until the coast was clear, and made my way to room 319. There he was. Ben Langley, pale, hooked to monitors, barely hanging on. I sat in the chair and waited, fatigue taking over. I must have dozed off, but I woke up to the sound of footsteps. A nurse entered to check on him. When she left, I stepped out of the shadows. Ben Langley startled but quickly regained his composure. His voice was hoarse and shaky. "Come closer," he muttered. "Let me see the face of my butcher." I flipped on a small bedside light. His eyes squinted as he adjusted to the glow. Recognition crossed his face, and he let out a short, bitter laugh. "So, Voss is farming out his dirty work now? Gutless coward. Well, get on with it," he sneered, bracing himself like a man resigned to his fate. "I'm not here to kill you, old man," I said plainly. His eyes narrowed. "Ellis? That you?" His face crumpled, not in fear, but relief. Tears ran down his face. It wasn't the reaction I'd expected, given our history. But for the next few hours, Ben Langley and I sat and talked. He shared information I hadn't expected, and by the time I left the hospital, I had two valuable things: a key to a safety deposit box and a plan to end all of this for good. Back at my motel, I texted Hank, letting him know I was still breathing. After a few hours of sleep, I showered, grabbed some takeout, and got ready to face the next step. The key to the safety deposit box weighed heavy in my pocket. But first, I had to make sure I wasn't being followed. I walked into a barber shop and had them shave my head and beard. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wanted them to see me coming. With my leaner, more muscular frame, I was barely recognizable as the man I'd been before. Ellis Granger was gone. Michael Harris was reborn. At the bank, I handed over the key to box 112. The manager treated me like a VIP, no questions asked. When I opened the box, I found a thick envelope and a stack of cash. I stuffed it all into my backpack and left. Back at the motel, I dumped everything on the bed. The first thing I checked was the envelope. Inside was a full dossier, a complete breakdown of everything I'd missed since my death. It had been compiled by Ben Langley, and it was clear he'd spared no expense. I spent the entire afternoon reading, and with every page, my anger burned hotter. It turned out I'd been a pawn in a twisted game from the very beginning. Here's what I learned: Carina and Linc had been in love for years. The idea that she had rejected him was a lie. They'd actually planned to elope, with Linc leaving the army to become a cop. But General Reed found out and had Linc's unit deployed overseas on a high-risk mission, hoping Linc wouldn't make it back. Carina had kept writing Linc letters, promising to wait for him. But when the general threatened to have Linc shipped home in a body bag, she broke it off out of fear. Linc survived, but he came back changed, a soldier with nothing to lose. Carina married me as part of a long con. She'd met me at the festival on purpose, thanks to info from her cousin Allison. The plan was simple: marry me to stay connected to Linc and give him time to come back and claim her. When our marriage lasted longer than she'd expected, Carina tried to push me away by cutting off intimacy, hoping I'd leave. But when I stayed, she adjusted her plan. Linc returned and rekindled his relationship with Carina in secret. She knew I was sterile, but she pretended I was the father when she got pregnant. They figured it would either force me to walk away or drive me to violence. They wanted me out of the picture. The most shocking part? Allison Greer knew everything. She and Carina had been close, and Allison had shared every detail with Ben Langley after she realized Linc and Carina were plotting against me. The pieces all fit. Linc's whole strategy had been to use me as a pawn. His goal was simple: destroy General Reed. He hated him more than anything in the world. To do it, he'd take everything from him: his reputation, his legacy, and his daughter. Carina, playing her part, married me to stay close to Linc while slowly dismantling her father's empire. With everything laid bare, I realized something even more chilling: I was never the target. I was a bystander caught in the blast radius of a war between Linc and General Reed. When I died, they celebrated. It gave them a clear path to everything they wanted. But then things escalated. Allison Greer died accidentally in a fall down the stairs. On the day of Allison's funeral, a car crash killed General Reed, his wife, and Allison's parents. Carina inherited everything: the Reed fortune, the family estate, and all their political connections. This wasn't a chance. It was a clean sweep. Linc and Carina had gotten rid of everyone standing in their way. But something wasn't adding up. Carina had reportedly suffered a miscarriage, but the report hinted it might not have been an accident. I suspected that once Linc started doubting if the baby was his, he had it taken care of. They married a month after the funeral. Carina Reed was finally Mrs. Carina Voss. I sat in silence, piecing it all together. This wasn't about love. It was about power. Linc had become everything he hated: a man with no rules and no limits. I realized something else: my family was still at risk. If Linc ever got bored or felt paranoid, he'd come for them next. I couldn't let that happen. My father used to say, when you've got a diseased dog, the most humane thing to do is put it down. The next morning, I called Hank. I'm ending this. Linc's at the Reed's mansion with Carina. I'm going after him. Hank tried to talk me down, but I'd already made up my mind. I thanked him for everything and made him promise to protect my family. He agreed reluctantly. I spent the rest of the day resting, sharpening my focus, and preparing my gear. Once it was dark, I drove toward Reed's mansion. I parked down the road, pulled on my gloves, and grabbed my SIG P228. I moved through the woods, remembering every detail of that house from when I dated Allison. Night vision goggles helped me scan for cameras. I saw Carina leave in her BMW and waited 5 minutes to be sure she was gone. Then I moved in. I slipped in through the garage. The house was eerily quiet. I crept toward the dining room, where I spotted him. Linc Voss, alone at the table, drinking wine, reading papers. I pulled out my weapon, breathing steady, finger on the trigger. But he felt me. He ducked, rolled, and fired in one fluid motion. I took a hit to the shoulder, pain searing through me. I fired back, missing. I retreated toward the garage, firing blindly to slow him down. Suddenly, the lights went out. I tripped and fell hard. 4 shots hit the door where I'd just been. Linc was hunting me now. I fired 2 shots in his direction but didn't hear him. My heart pounded in my ears. My shoulder was bleeding badly, my arm weak. I braced myself, knowing I might not get out alive. Then the driveway lights came on. Linc stood there, blood dripping from his temple. I'd grazed him. Between us lay a knife. We both reached for it. "Never bring a knife to a gunfight, Ellis," he taunted. But before either of us could act, blood sprayed from his head. Linc's body crumpled. Hank Nusselt stepped forward, gun still raised. He'd come for me. Hank dragged me outside, stopped the bleeding, then went back in. He returned a few minutes later and drove us away at high speed. When I woke up, I was at Hank's house, sore but alive. He'd called in a favor with a retired doctor to patch me up. Linc Voss was dead. The news called it an attempted home invasion by 2 unidentified gunmen. No leads. No suspects. Linc was given a hero's funeral. But dead is dead. A week later, I learned Carina had taken her own life. She left a note, "I can't live without him." Typical Carina, selfish to the end. Now I'm driving to Hank's house with Jess by my side. Ellis Granger is still dead. But Michael Harris lives. As the miles roll by, I think about everything: love, betrayal, friendship, and war. My father was right. The past doesn't define you. Only the future does. And I will survive.